Suppose with me for a moment, Mike and Debbie and we were going out for lunch to talk over some of the upcoming special music here at the church. And there's different options, we can take to where we'll have our lunch. But we decide this week to meet up at Sonny's. We all like barbecue here. And so we set a time and a date, and we all meet up there in the parking lot there at Sonny's. Say it's on a Tuesday, and we head in to eat our lunch. As we walk into the door, there's a hostess stand. It says, wait here, and someone will seat you shortly. So we stand there for a while and look around and stand there a little longer. And after a while, I could look across the restaurant and see the hostess standing over there on the other side of the room. Only she's not looking at me. She's looking at her boss. As he's rebuking her, as I approach, I can hear the discussion. I can hear him telling her, how many times have I told you, you don't seat people before you bus the tables. Wait until the table's cleared and wiped off. It's not too hard to remember, is it? He marches off. I know the discussion isn't something I need to be a part of, so I back up. I go back to the front, and pretty soon she approaches us, and she grabs a couple menus. Follow me. As we're walking toward the table, she looks over us. She says, he's such an idiot. He got promoted to manager just last month. And he thinks he's such a big shot here, Well, he's not. Everyone's been leaving this place. 2 waitresses quit last week, and I know 2 more that are already thinking about going out the door, and I'm one of them. Here's your table. Notice, it's cleared off. Huh? The hostess, she leaves. We sit down in our seats, and pretty soon our waitress comes by. She stops and looks at the table. Hasn't your busboy been here? You haven't got water yet? I have to do everything around here. His job and my job. Robert, can you get some water to this table here? She turns back to us. I'll give you guys a couple of minutes now. You look over the menu, and I'll come back for your order. The busboy comes up, and he drops off water. Gets some table settings here. He lays our forks and our napkins down. As he's putting them down, he looks over at us. She's supposed to share her tips with me, I'm pretty sure she's stiffing me. I bus her tables week after week, and I know what people order. I clean those plates. I know what they're paying to eat here. I know what she should be getting. She's supposed to give me a percentage of that, She's supposed to share it with me. I got half a mind just to let her clean her own tables. The busboy leaves, and in a minute, the waitress comes back. What do y'all have today? Mike says, I'll order brisket. Debbie asks about the pot roast. Is it any good? It's okay. Debbie goes with pulled pork. What are you guys going to drink? Mike orders a Diet Coke, water for Debbie, and I grab some coffee. Pretty soon the waitress comes back. She brings the Diet Coke and the water, but no coffee. Well, sorry about that. They forgot to start a new pot. I have to do everything right here. I got the pot started. I'll get you your coffee in a moment. It'll just be a few minutes, sir. Pretty soon we get our food, and we eat, and we leave. No coffee. We've finished a lot of our business, but there's still a little more to get through. And so out there in the parking lot, we understand that we're going to have to get together again next week. And so as we're getting into our cars, we make plans to meet next Tuesday to finish up the schedule for the month. Where are we going to have lunch? Come back here? No, Debbie says. They're fighting and complaining and disputing. They don't even like each other. Most of them don't even like cooking here. You see, when you're complaining and you're murmuring, it drives people away, doesn't it? Mike speaks up. There's a Cracker Barrel up there in the next exit. Yeah, that's what we'll do. We'll meet there. And so next week, we meet up there. And as we're walking in next Tuesday into the Cracker Barrel, the manager is standing there beside the hostess, and we can hear him talking to her. They pause their conversation for a moment. Welcome to Cracker Barrel. How many today? 3 people for lunch? Okay. And the hostess, she brings us to our table. And just after that, we can still hear over there in the hostess stand, the conversation continued, and the manager is praising the waitress. You're doing a fine job, Susan. You've got a good way with the customers. Keep up the good work. I love how you're doing it. She brings the waitress over to our table, comes by and notices we don't have any water. Oh my, I'm so sorry. Let me get those for you. Our busboy, he's actually working a double shift this week. Somebody called in sick, and he's been covering so many of the tables. He's got a lot of work. I'll take care of that, Johnny. Don't you worry about it. I've got these waters. You go ahead and clear those tables over there. Can I get you guys anything to drink? Oh, Diet Coke, water, and coffee, please. In a minute, she comes back. She's got the Diet Coke, and she's got the water, but no coffee. Our coffee's so popular, she says it goes so fast. And there was just enough to give you at the bottom of the pot. I could have brought that to you, but I wanted you to have a fresh pot. And so I started a brand new pot. It'll be just a moment. You're going to love our coffee. We finish up our meal, pay the bill, and head to the car. As me, Mike, and Debbie were looking at each other, that's a good place. Let's come back here next time. Oh, yeah. Yeah, next week, Tuesday. Much like a restaurant, that's a lot like the Church of God, isn't it? When God's people are complaining and when they're disputing with each other, when they don't like each other, it drives people away, doesn't it? But when God's people are kind, and when they're grateful, and when they love each other, when His children care about one another, and when a visitor drops in, those visitors can tell there's a difference in this place. And they're like, God is in this place. That's exactly what Paul is telling the church at Philippi here in our passage this morning. He's encouraging them, to be grateful for what they have, not to complain or to murmur, but to care about each other, to be gracious to each other, to be kind to one another. He says they're a part of God's family, they're God's children, and he tells them in Philippians 2, verses 14 through 15, that when they're kind and loving toward each other, unbelievers are drawn to the gospel. They see something different in them, and they're drawn to the life of God. Philippians 2, verses 14 through 15, we read this: do all things without complaining, disputing, verse 15, that you may be blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, whom you shine as lights in the world. Friend, when we're not complaining, when we're not murmuring, when we're not disputing, when we are loving, and when we're kind to one another, we glow for the gospel, it says here. It says that we shine as lights to the world, and others, they see what God's family is like. And you know what? When they see God's family like that, they want to be a part of that family. They want to be a part of that. They love you because you love each other. They want to be loved. I'm sorry. Another thing that happens when we're grateful and when we're gracious to one another is that it shows those who have given, those who have sacrificed, those who have given up for us on our behalf, that their labor has all been worth it. Think about those who have sacrificed for you in your Christian life. Those who have given up for you. Those who have sacrificed and have given for you. Think about those people. Paul here, think about Paul. He says here, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. You know, Paul had given up so much for this church. He had sacrificed so much for these believers. And he knows that at any point, this could mean the end of him. Here he is in this Roman jail cell. He could die. His life could be coming to an end. And here he is, knowing all of this. He says in verses 17 through 18, yes, and if I am poured out as a drink offering, and on the sacrifice and service of your faith, it's okay. He says, I am glad and rejoice with you all for the same reason you also are glad and rejoice with me. This imagery here that Paul uses in verse 17, it actually comes from the Old Testament. When a sacrifice was offered to God on the altar, it was put on the altar and the fire beneath it would burn, right? That would create an aroma that would rise toward heaven. And the Bible called that a sweet-smelling savor unto God. And you know, it was normal for Jews above that to pour either oil, perhaps wine onto the sacrifice, and that liquid would become what's called a drink offering. That would add to the aroma, and it would add to the offering. And what Paul is saying here is, look, my imprisonment, you know, it might lead to my death. This might be the end of my life. But if that's the case, that's okay. It'll all be worth it. Because it'll simply be my last opportunity to add myself as an offering about what you have already become before God. And if that happens, I rejoice because of that. Because he knows that as he's pouring himself out for the Philippians, he knows that they are pouring themselves out for God. And that's of course, the question, though, the bigger question is, how can we be that kind of church? How can we be a church that resembles this? What steps can we take to lead us in that direction? Well, that's what he answers in the first part of our passage this morning, what we overlooked this morning. You see, we do it as we live out that new life that God has given us every day. We are that kind of church as we walk and as we work out that salvation that God has given us, knowing that God himself is working within us as we work that out among each other. Look back with me at verse 12, if you will. We're in Philippians 12, chapter 2, verse 12. Paul says this, as you have always obeyed me in my presence, now obey me in my absence. Work out your own salvation. Philippians 2:12. That word obey there, it really is the word listen. Listening to Paul when he's with them, right, in their presence, well, that's to be expected. But you see, Paul has been absent from them from some time now. Now he's in a Roman prison. What do you do when no one's looking over your shoulders to make sure that you are doing the right thing? What are you doing when no one is watching you? And that's kind of what Paul is saying here. Look, you've always listened to me when I was with you, and now that I'm absent, my prayer is that you will continue to do what you've always done, that you would continue to listen and to obey me. He says, work without, chapter 2, verse 12, what God is already working within. In other words, live in such a way, chapter 1, verse 27, you remember? Live in such a way that is worthy of the gospel. Put into practice what God is already doing in your heart, Christian. Notice here what he says in verse 12 though. Notice he doesn't say to work for your salvation. You see that, right? said that, he'd be contradicting other things that he had said in other places throughout the New Testament. Paul's already said the exact opposite in verses we're very familiar with in Ephesians 2, and I'll read them to you. Verses 8 and 9. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And what does it say next? And that not of yourselves. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. And then what does it say in verse 10? For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. You see that? Which God had prepared before Him that we should walk in Him. And here in Philippians, Paul is saying something very similar, that the salvation that God has already given you, right? It's an awesome thing. It's an awesome thing to be a Christian, to know the Lord as your Savior. And it's my prayer, Paul says, that you would continue to live your life in such a way that is worthy of that salvation, that is worthy of the gospel, of your heavenly citizenship. You would walk and work in a way that is allowing God's new life in you to shine before a lost and a dying world. A life that God has already begun in you. And then he adds this, my brethren, as you've always obeyed, and not as in my presence only, but now also in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. When we say fear and trembling here, we're not talking about being horrified, right? Not being terrified or kind of taken back in that way. No, that's not what it's talking about. Mike was an electrician, so I can't relate to this. We were driving the other day. He was telling me a story about somebody working on a power line, and it was a sad story. But have you ever worked around electricity? You ever worked on a breaker box? I have. If you're working on that breaker box, are you ever fearful when you're working on that kind of power? I often think when I'm working in the kitchen on a 20 amp, man, I sure hope that breaker's working, I'm terrified sometimes in that way, But is it a debilitating fear, right? No, it's not. But it is a fear that drives me to pay attention. It's a fear that helps me to focus exactly on what I'm doing. A fear, if you will, that is grounded, pun intended, in an accurate view of my limitations and the ability of that voltage to do some serious harm to me. All right? I respect it. That's the kind of fear that we're to have here. A reverent fear, a respect, a kind of humility, if you will, as we live and as we walk the gospel life day by day. Because we know that God is living in us. And we know that God is working behind the scenes in all of our lives. In fact, if you remember, that is how the book of Philippians started. You remember in Philippians 1:6, where Paul wrote, and I am sure of this, that Philippians 1:6, he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. And Paul is bringing us back to that truth again here in verse 13. Because he says this, he says, for it is God for it is God who works in you both to will and to do of His good pleasure. You know what that verse tells me there? It tells me that God's not just working with me. God is working in me. He is not just among us, but He is within us. Salvation is God's work from the first to the last. And friend, that is pure gospel. That is pure grace. And realizing that, knowing that God is working in us and through us to accomplish His own purposes. And when you think of it that way, you think of verses like 2 Peter in chapter 1, verse 3. You recognize that God has given you and I everything we need to walk worthy of the gospel. 2 Peter 1:3 says, His divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. Verse 13 here it says, For it is God who works in you both to will and to do His. Now that doesn't mean we're to think of ourselves as helpless. That's not the point here. We're not to think less of ourselves, right? We mentioned that the other week. We're to think of ourselves less. And we're to remember that God is the one at work behind the scenes, working through our lives. You know, there's an interesting tension between our actions and our reliance upon God. In fact, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but if you look forward to Philippians 4:13, in a very famous verse when Paul will say, I can do all things. He didn't say I couldn't do anything. He said I can do anything. I can do all things. Why? Because Christ is in him. I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. There's another verse in the Gospel of John in chapter 15 that mentions something similar to this. In John 15:5, I don't know if you know the verse, where Jesus said that I am the vine. You are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. Without me, you can do nothing. You know, both of these verses, they really are arguing the same thing, aren't they? Both Philippians 4 and John 15 are telling us that God is working in us. And we can accomplish anything because of that. But we have to recognize that. We have to recognize that God is at work in our lives. And when we do, we recognize that all things are possible because of His involvement. And so the point this morning, the message this morning is, Christian, work out your own salvation. Live out what God is working within the life that God has begun in you, with fear and trembling, knowing that God is at work in your life. As we abide in Him and trust in His power, and as we watch, we see God doing that. And we notice we're not complaining as much. We're not murmuring. Instead, we're being kind to one another. And we're loving one another. And you know when that happens? Unbelievers are going to see that. They're going to see that. And they're going to be drawn to the gospel. And we find in verse 15, and when we will stand before the lost as blameless, harmless children of God, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation. I just want to read that. Holding fast, without fault, amid a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights of the world. Holding fast the word of life. Christian, that is what